Donovan Parks stood amid the clutter of his garage and smiled proudly. Though boxes of old clothing and items that belonged in a long-needed garage sale were scattered about in no particular fashion, it was the jumble of metal, wire, cables and computer components that was in the back of the garage that took his full attention. At first glance, the jumble looked much like the rest of the family's discarded junk that filled the garage, though in truth, it was much, much more than that. "Pretty nifty, eh?" Donovan asked aloud, glancing back towards his family, which stood just inside the garage, each looking as if they were afraid something sinister might jump out of the clutter and bite them. Yeah, Dad." 15-year-old AJ responded with a noticeable lack of enthusiasm, though Donovan still didn't seem to notice. AJ scratched at his somewhat unruly mop of reddish-brown hair and continued to scowl as he glanced over the garage. He was average height for his age but still rather skinny and undeveloped looking. A trait that he'd inherited from his father, though often wished that he hadn't. "Looks really neat," he added, extra sarcasm in case his father missed it. Jean Parks, Donovan's devoted wife of 16 years, let out a barely audible sigh and rolled her eyes. "It's lovely, dear. But I thought you were going to clean out the garage, not bring in more clutter." Forcing a smile, Jean just stood there and watched Donovan, silently amazed at her own patience. She shook her head slightly, her dark brown, nearly black hair shifted back and forth but still never quite touched her shoulders, which it hung above. Then a giggle drew the rest of the family's attention towards 6-year-old Melissa. She giggled again as she ignored her family and focused on a box that she'd opened unnoticed. Then, with a proud smile, she pulled out several pieces of oversized clothes and held them up. "Can we play dress-up, Mommy?" Melissa asked in wide-eyed delight. The usually forbidden garage excited Melissa since she found herself surrounded by boxes and piles of treasure and potential toys. She glanced around brightly, her eyes gleaming slightly greedily as she wondered what she could sneak out and back to her room. She was sure that her favorite doll that had mysteriously disappeared several months earlier had to be hiding in there somewhere. Not to mention all the other things she could find to play with. "Not now," Jean snapped absently, barely glancing at Melissa. "Now get over here." "Yes, Mommy," Melissa responded sadly, dropping the clothes on the floor and moving back towards her family. Donovan barely seemed to notice the side discussion, his attention too much on the semi-organized pile of metal parts. "It's finally finished," Donovan said proudly. "I knew that I could do it." "Wow, Dad," AJ exclaimed almost excitedly, "you mean you finally found a cure for baldness?" Instinctively putting a hand to his receding hairline, Donovan shook his head. "Nope. Better." Then after a moment, he corrected, "Almost." "Well, dear," Jean prompted, trying to hide her impatience. Donovan's occasional aspirations as an inventor had been one of the most trying aspects of their long marriage, though she'd long learned to humor him when he got an inspiration. "What do you have to show us?" Then in a slightly less pleasant tone, she added, "Especially when I thought you were supposed to be busy cleaning out this place." "It's a gate," Donovan announced proudly, stepping towards the apparent machine and kicking several boxes out of the way. The machine looked rather cobbled together and piecemeal, though it was apparent that there was some sort of archway that was somewhat circular and had an opening nearly 7 feet tall. AJ snickered slightly while Melissa stared with hungry eyes at a badly faded stuffed horse in one corner. "Just great, Dad," AJ said with an amused grin. He couldn't help but wondering what his dad had wasted his time on this time. "I was watching TV when suddenly I was struck by an inspiration," Donovan announced proudly, running a hand gently on the arch. "This is a gate to another dimension." Donovan grinned at his family, all of whom watched him less than enthusiastically. "We can go through it to see fantastic sights that no one has ever seen." "Yeah, sure, Dad," AJ responded, trying to keep from laughing. Donovan didn't notice Jean rolling her eyes as he stared at his machine. He smiled proudly, deciding not to mention that the inspiration to build it had come while watching that TV show Sliders. After all, he figured that if they could do it on TV, he could do it even better. "Are we going on a trip, Daddy?" Melissa asked curiously, moving next to Donovan. "Yes, we are, honey," Donovan answered, bending down to give his daughter a quick kiss on the cheek. Melissa giggled at that and hugged Donovan tightly. A moment later, Donovan reached over and pushed several buttons on the machine. It hummed for just a few seconds, and then to AJ and Jean's surprise, a silvery gray mist formed within the archway, moving into a swirling vortex that filled the whole thing. The arch almost seemed to have a wall formed within it, though formed over the swirling mist. "Oh shit," AJ muttered in surprise, only to feel Jean's hand swept the back of his head. "Watch your language," Jean warned AJ. Then to her husband, she said, impressive. "Pretty daddy." Melissa chimed in cheerfully, her hand clutched tightly on an old teapot that no one had noticed her picking up. Regaining his composure, AJ smirked a little and decided that he could at least be a little impressed with the special effects. However, he didn't have the least doubt that it would fail just as miserably as his father's attempt to make a flying car. "Well," Donovan asked cheerfully, "are you all ready to see another world?" Jean frowned as she carefully moved towards the archway. "I don't know. Is it safe?" With a snort, Donovan answered, "Of course it's safe." After staring at the swirling mist for a moment, Jean shook her head, feeling foolish for even considering that it might work. Of course it wouldn't work, but she didn't want to hurt her Donovan's feelings, so she was going to have to humor him. Just like always. "Let's get this over with," AJ muttered. "I want to go to play ball with some friends." Jean glared at him, giving him a look that told him to humor his father. "Next destination," Donovan called out like a train conductor, "through the gate." Without another word, they each started towards the swirling mist of Donovan's so-called gate. Donovan was the first through, feeling proud as the cold tingle washed over him. It was just a little chilly and almost damp feeling, much like walking into a fog bank. AJ shivered slightly as the mist washed over him, and much to his surprise, instead of walking back out the other side of the arch, he found himself completely surrounded by the mist. His father was still in front of him, though just a little harder to see through the swirling mist that surrounded them as far as he could see, which wasn't very far. "Wow!" Melissa exclaimed, coming up behind AJ with her mother's hand grasping hers. "Neato." "Oh dear," Jean gasped, stopping along with the others. Donovan's eyes widened as he looked around, not seeing anything but the mist that surrounded him. There was no sign of his garage or even of the gate that they'd just come through. "Man, Dad," AJ said, "this is definitely weird." The smirk no longer decorated his face, and even his skepticism of his father's invention was beginning to fade. Then after a moment, AJ coughed slightly and continued, "But why the hell would you want to come here?" Jean glared at AJ for a moment but then looked at Donovan nervously. Her hand clutched Melissa's even tighter. Is this what you intended, honey?" Donovan was silent for a moment as he looked around him, a look of concentration on his face. He glanced at each of his family members in turn and gulped, "I'm not sure." In truth, Donovan was becoming very scared and wished that he'd never tried out his machine. A part of him had never expected it to work, but it definitely did. He just wasn't quite sure if it was working the way he wanted or what he'd do if it did. "I want to go back," Melissa whimpered slightly. She nudged even closer to her mother, feeling really scared in the spooky place. She really wanted to go home. "Is the little baby scared?" AJ said, trying to keep the nervousness out of his own voice. He felt a little guilty for teasing his little sister, but at least it made him feel a little less afraid. "Enough of that," Jean said half-heartedly. She bent down and gave Melissa a comforting hug, then suggested that they return to the garage. The others quickly agreed, including Donovan. However, after going back the way that they had come, there was still no sign of the gate. They frantically started looking, keeping each other in close sight, but still found nothing. "Oh shit!" AJ exclaimed nervously. Jean and Donovan were beginning to get afraid themselves and didn't even think to correct AJ's foul language. Jean glared at Donovan. "You and your stupid inventions." She immediately regretted the venom in her voice, especially with her children there. "I know," Donovan whispered, feeling rather guilty. It should have worked. He was sure of it. Suddenly they were all surprised by a cough from behind them. They snapped around, only to see a figure emerging from the mist. The figure was dressed in a gray robe with the hood hung low over its face. A silvery metal belt clung tightly about its waist. Then the figure spoke. "Oh dear," the figure said in a male voice in a British-sounding accent. "This is not good. Not good at all." "What the?" AJ started, but Donovan asked, "Who are you?" Jean gulped and clenched the obviously scared Melissa's hand tighter while AJ noticed her fear and patted her on the head, giving her a brief smile before scowling at the man in the robes. "Pardon me," the figure said, pulling back his hood and revealing his face. He was an elderly-looking man with somewhat long white hair, at least what he had since he was nearly bald on top. The man had a large white mustache that drooped down past his chin on both sides, making him look something like the White Knight from Alice in Wonderland. "I am the keeper of this limbo." "Limbo?" AJ asked, feeling a little confused. The keeper nodded. "You have entered the crawl space between dimensions. A buffer zone, if you will, which it is my duty and honor to monitor." The keeper tugged slightly on one side of his mustache for a little, staring intently at each of them. "This is most unfortunate." "Yes, most unfortunate indeed." He almost seemed to be talking to himself. "What do you mean?" Donovan asked, no longer feeling scared. After all, the keeper certainly didn't look like he could be any kind of threat. Even Melissa didn't seem to be quite so afraid anymore and had let loose of Jean's hand. "And where's my gate at?" "We can't find it." The keeper continued frowning as he carefully looked the family over. "There is a slight problem." Donovan gulped. "What problem?" Then more aggressively, he said, "I made a gate to go to other dimensions and came here. All we need to do is find it so that we can go back through." "That's the problem," the keeper sighed regretfully. "You, like several others before you, have found the loophole which allows you to leave your native dimension. Unfortunately, the physics which you used to find this loophole do not exist within this limbo, hence the other side of your gate cannot manifest or even exist here." AJ scowled, still feeling a bit scared and nervous but hiding it with his aggressive, "Why don't you say it in English, mister?" Raising his eyebrow and AJ, the keeper explained, "Your gate is one way. You can't go back." "What?" Jean, Donovan and AJ all echoed in once. With a faint nod of his head, the keeper continued, "There is no way that I can return you. And there is more. As soon as you left, your universe acted to fill in the void of your sudden absence." Tugging gently at his mustache again, the keeper added, "It is now as if none you never existed there." "We don't exist?" Jean asked in confusion. "That don't make no sense." AJ grumbled, "And what do you mean we can't go back?" He glared at the keeper and then his dad. Donovan gasped, feeling even guiltier than before. He wasn't quite sure about the rest of what the keeper had said, but he couldn't miss the fact that he couldn't go back. "You mean we're stuck here?" he demanded, trying to keep the panic from his voice. "For the rest of our lives?" Jean gasped loudly in horror while Melissa said, "I want to go home." She looked as if she was pouting but not as if she was going to cry. AJ doubted that she even understood that they couldn't go home yet. "Oh no," the keeper said, sounding part surprised and part amused, "I never said that you had to remain here for the rest of your lives. In fact, I would much prefer that you didn't." He gave a slight smile at that, then continued, "As I said, there is no way for you to return to your previous universe, but I can get you into the next one." "The next one?" Donovan asked, his eyes brightening suddenly. "So my machine really does let me go to other dimensions?" After the keeper nodded, he muttered, "I just never thought that there'd be this place in the way." "Aren't you forgetting something?" Jean asked, trying to keep her voice calm though she truly wanted to scream at Donovan. She couldn't believe that he'd been stupid enough to build that damn machine, or that she'd been stupid enough to go through it, dragging their kids along with them. If we supposedly can't get back home, how are we supposed to go to someplace else? Our lives are back there. All of our friends and family. We have to get back. "I'm sorry," the keeper said, but you were the ones who chose to leave your reality. Now you must deal with the consequences." Sighing, he looked a little more sympathetic. "The next universe is very much like your own. Nearly identical in fact in all appearances." He smiled slightly and added, "You would have to travel to much further realms to find great differences. However, the laws of physics between these two dimensions are slightly different. Enough so that the new one can sometimes allow entry. However, it lacks the loopholes in your last that allowed for your departure." AJ stared at the keeper and gulped nervously. He glanced at his dad and then Mom before finally settling his eyes on Melissa. She looked rather confused but seemed to be watching their father with a confidence and trust in her eyes that everything would be all right. He only wished that he could share that faith. "So we can go in," Donovan stated, "but we can't come back out." "Precisely," the keeper responded. "And it's just like home?" Jean asked hesitantly. After the keeper had assured her that it was, Jean let out a sigh of relief. However, the keeper cautioned them seriously, holding up a hand as he did so. "I must give you further warning." He stared at them each in turn with a gaze that sent chills down each of their spines. His eyes almost seemed to have turned silvery for a moment as he said, "You do not have places in that realm. In fact, it is extremely likely that you have parallel alternates already existing there, living the same lives that you have just left. I have seen several others enter and can assure you that this realm will not accept you as you are. As aliens to it." "What do you mean?" Donovan asked nervously, beginning to like the sound of this less and less with every moment. He was still hanging on to the hope that the keeper might be wrong or even lying and that they could return home, but a part of him knew that the keeper was telling the truth. And honestly, though he would never admit it to the others, he was also excited by the prospect of seeing a new world. "Even if it was just like home. It will assimilate you," the keeper continued calmly. "Take you in and make you part of its own. Give you new lives and existences." "New lives?" Jean gasped, clutching Melissa's hand tightly. She glared at Donovan again, knowing that it was all his fault. "And what's wrong with our own lives?" "Because you already exist there and it will not be allowed," the keeper explained. "I have no control over this. I am just warning you as to what you may expect upon arrival. You would be given new lives, usually at random. There is no way for me to predict who you will all become or where you will end up. You may end up, each given lives in different places with no connection to each other." Donovan and Jean gasped at that, and though AJ thought that it would be pretty scary, he couldn't help thinking that it might be kind of cool too. However, after a moment he decided that it would definitely not be good to be left on his own, with no friends or family. Before anyone could say anything, the keeper went on, "Shall you enter, the universe will assimilate you as it will. However, I can give several guidelines." The keeper put an old hand out and gently touched Jean's face, his fingers wiping the tears from her cheek. "I am able to influence things a little. Enough to at least give you some choices in your lives." "We can choose." AJ gasped. "Awesome." In his mind, he couldn't help thinking that this was sort of like having a genie to grant wishes. He could wish for almost anything in his new life and almost grinned as he thought of all the things that he wanted. Suddenly holding his hand up again, the keeper said, "Only some." He smiled gently as he added, "You may each make one suggestion for your lives. That is the most that I can do." For a long moment, they all stared at the keeper silently. Without saying a word, the keeper held out his hands and gave a look of intense concentration. A silvery ball of glowing light formed in the air between them and then remained floating there when he stepped back. "You may give your guidelines," the keeper said. Jean gave Donovan a look of surprise and then stepped forward. She felt rather embarrassed at doing this but knew that she had to help her family. She paused for a moment and glanced at her children again before continuing, "I just want us to remain a family." Donovan nodded, very pleased by Jean's request. He felt proud of her for thinking of it since he doubted that he would have considered it himself. After thinking about it for a moment, Donovan carefully said, "I want a fun job with great pay and free time to spend with my family." He smiled, hoping that it would work out right. Now that that's done, Jean started, however she was interrupted by AJ. "Hey," AJ said, obviously annoyed, "it's my turn." Jean glared at him, but Donovan barely seemed to notice as he stared at the keeper's floating ball. Then AJ felt a little smug as he said, "I want to be the most popular kid in my high school." He smiled, pleased at himself though still trying to hide his fear and confusion at their situation. "Very well then," the keeper said. With that, he gestured to the floating sphere, his face having a look of concentration. Then, the sphere started to grow and stretch out, becoming a floating disc of swirling silver, resembling a cross between Donovan's gate and a mirror. "You may enter through the gate and into your new lives." He paused for a moment and gently said, "I wish you all luck." "Thank you," Donovan told him quietly, though his eyes never left the gate. They all started towards the gate, and just after AJ stepped through first and Jean started to, Melissa suddenly got a bright look in her eyes and playful smile on her face. Then she turned and ran straight at the keeper, surprising Donovan when she hugged his legs. Still smiling mischievously, Melissa quickly asked, "Can I be the mommy?" Then without another word, Melissa ran straight back to her family and through the gate. Donovan, who was the last one, shook his head and chuckled. "Kids." He'd heard Melissa's request and couldn't help smiling as he stepped through the gate himself. Of course, he knew that it was not only too late to make any more requests since the gate was open and they were through, but the keeper certainly wouldn't do something like. AJ felt the slight chill of the mist suddenly leave him and he was once again in a warmer environment. He glanced around, almost surprised to see that he was inside of a house. Inside of a fairly large and well-decorated living room. "Wow," AJ muttered, glancing around and feeling a little impressed. Then he became aware of the rest of his family suddenly appearing out of midair beside him. "Oh dear," Jean whispered, obviously impressed. "This is nice." Melissa gasped, "Oh. Where are we?" "Home, I assume," Donovan answered quietly, feeling rather curious. He glanced back and saw no sign of the gate that they'd just come through. After waving his hand through the area behind him, where he'd just come from, he had to admit that it wasn't there. "I suppose we'd better look around." After AJ started to leave the living room, he suddenly paused by the door as a faint dizziness washed over him. He had to grab hold of the doorframe to keep from losing his balance. Then he heard Melissa gasp, "I feel funny." With a quick glance back, AJ saw that the others weren't quite as lucky. His mom had caught her balance against the new couch, but Melissa and his dad had fallen to their knees, obviously overcome by the same dizziness that he felt. "I'm so dizzy," Jean gasped, feeling afraid. "What's going on?" I think we're adapting to this place," Donovan answered, standing up and looking a lot steadier. AJ only wished that he was ready to stand again without the doorframe's support. Then suddenly the dizziness vanished and AJ let go of the doorframe. "Glad that's over," he grumbled. Then he gave his dad a quick glare. After all, it was all his fault. Then with a shrug, AJ hurried to go find his new bedroom, still furious that he lost his old one. After a few minutes, AJ was somewhat surprised to find the new house he was in looking sort of familiar. Though he'd never seen it before in his life, a part of him was starting to feel as if he'd lived there for a very long time. And without consciously realizing it, he started up the stairs and towards where he instinctively knew his new bedroom was. When AJ was just a few feet from the door to what he knew was his bedroom, he suddenly winced as a spasm shot through his body. "Oh God," AJ gasped, wincing again as his whole body started to cramp up at once. He bent over as an intense wave shot through his stomach, tearing at his guts. Every muscle froze up and felt unbelievably sore. "Oh shit," AJ cried, dropping to his knees. Then suddenly, the cramping stopped. All of the pain vanished as quickly as it had come and AJ unsteadily got back to his feet. He shook his head, still feeling rather strange though he couldn't place exactly why. After glancing at his bedroom door one more time, AJ pushed his way inside. "What the hell?" AJ gasped as he frantically glanced around the room, his eyes nearly ready to pop right out of his head. It certainly couldn't be his room, no matter what his instincts said. Posters of the Backstreet Boys and NSYNC decorated the walls, as well as one of Leonardo DiCaprio. The bed was covered with a white comforter that had pink hearts all over it. Several dolls lined a shelf on the wall, and the dresser was lined with bottles and jars of all sorts of makeup and perfumes. But as wrong as the room was, a part of him still screamed familiarity. Screamed that it truly was his. AJ blinked uncomprehendingly and whispered, "I don't understand." But without warning, the cramps and dizziness suddenly washed over AJ again. This time, however, it was less intense, but in an odd way, even more so. Barely able to stand, AJ stumbled to the bed and promptly collapsed across it. "What's happening to me?" AJ asked himself weakly. However, there were no answers. Merely a strange twisting that seemed to fill his every fiber. Suddenly, everything went blurry to AJ as even his sight was affected. His entire body felt strangely warm as he felt it changing, but at the same time, very good. Very comforting. Then everything snapped back to normal. AJ frowned and sat up from his bed, feeling much better. It took him a moment to realize that there was a weight on his chest. He looked down and then stared at the breasts that pushed out from the front of a pinkish t-shirt that obviously belonged to a girl. A quick glance revealed that the rest of his clothes, not to mention his body, also belonged to a girl. "What the hell?" AJ gasped, frowning at the fact that he didn't feel anywhere near as strange as he would have expected, or as panicked. In fact, he felt surprisingly normal. With a strange confidence, AJ moved to his dresser, specifically to the large mirror on top of it. A single glance revealed an extremely attractive blonde girl looking back. A blonde girl whom he'd never seen before in his life, but suddenly recognized as an image that was very familiar. "I'm beautiful," AJ said, partly in surprise and partly with pride. Then he smiled, knowing that this was why he was the most popular girl in school. With that, AJ realized that she had a whole new life and all of the memories to go with them. "My name is Delilah," she whispered, knowing that this was so for a fact. She was 17 years old and not only captain of the cheerleader and volleyball teams but also president of the school council. The memory of earning each of these positions was quite clear to her, as was growing up a girl and living her entire life as such. However, she still clearly remembered being AJ. Very strange. Delilah mused, deciding that she might as well get used to it. Then, with a chuckle, she realized that she already was. After all, she had been Delilah for her entire life, at least as far as this universe was concerned. Jean cried out in pain as the cramps suddenly washed over her body. Everything went dizzy again and she collapsed to the floor, curling up into a ball and crying, "What's happening to me?" After a moment, the cramps went away and she got back to her feet, glancing around the living room and wishing that Donovan hadn't taken Melissa to try finding her new bedroom. She might feel like the new house was familiar, but she wasn't quite sure that she liked being left alone just yet. Then the cramps and dizziness returned and Jean once again collapsed to the floor. After a moment, she felt the strange warmth and the changes that started to overtake her body. She was terrified as everything suddenly changed. In nearly the blink of an eye, the entire room seemed to expand before her eyes, growing larger and larger while scaring her even more. Suddenly the changes all stopped and Jean cautiously sat up though made no move to return to her feet. Her eyes went wide in horror as she looked around the now gigantic seeming room and then down at herself. Gone was the semi-conservative blouse and slacks, replaced instead by a pair of oversized shorts and a blue t-shirt, the clothing of a little boy. Feeling extremely scared, Jean, now 4-year-old Brandon, did what felt completely natural. He cried out, "Mommy," and burst into tears. Part of him, the Jean part, knew that he should act more mature, but there was now too much child for that, a child who desperately needed to be comforted. Melissa frowned to herself as they walked through the house. She'd felt really scared earlier when she'd started to hurt, but her daddy had made it all get better. But now that they were looking for her bedroom, and unable to find it, Melissa knew that there was something funny happening but she didn't know what. Suddenly, Melissa let out a scream of pain as she fell to the floor in the middle of the hallway. She barely noticed her daddy coming towards her before he fell to the ground too. Instead, she closed her eyes and curled up, hurting really bad and trying to cry. Then the pain started to go away and she felt very funny, even in her head. "I feel strange," Melissa gasped as she opened her eyes and got to her feet. Then she gasped again to realize how far away the ground looked, and how normal that seemed. The strangeness of her situation scared her, but she forced herself to remain calm, knowing that she could handle it. For a moment, Melissa remained standing before looking down at her own body and whispering, "Amazing." She had a very generous pair of breasts pushing out in front, and from what else she could tell about her figure, a very nice and shapely body. Long blonde hair cascaded down past her shoulders and she smiled pleasantly, feeling a surge of vanity at what she'd always thought of as her best feature. The thought that it was a completely new feature never really dawned on her. "Oh my," a male voice said from behind her. A very familiar male voice. Snapping around, she saw a tall and somewhat athletic-looking man standing there. He had red hair and a well-trimmed beard. The very sight of him brought a smile to her lips as she saw the lover of her life, and her husband. "Jerry." She stared, suddenly frowning as she realized that this wasn't her husband. It was her father. Wasn't he? She wasn't too sure at the moment, especially when she thought about her memories. Her eyes went even wider as she realized that her name was Veronica Edwards, a 37-year-old wife and mother who still looked years younger. She glanced at her husband and frowned, still just as clearly remembering her life as Melissa. "Melissa," Jerry said hesitantly, then gulped before asking, "Veronica?" Veronica paused and smirked slightly. "I think Veronica might be more appropriate, honey," she purred. She moved closer to Jerry and gave him a passionate kiss on the lips, the same as she always did while grabbing at his crotch with her hand. Melissa never felt anything like this. Jerry stared at her for a moment, his own new memories telling him that this was completely normal. That he had been married to Veronica for a very long time, and loved every minute of it. He smiled as he recalled his career as a sought-after fashion photographer and most of all, the gorgeous model whom he'd fallen in love with and married. "We've assimilated," Jerry said hesitantly, frowning as he suddenly remembered their 2 children. Their daughter and son, though it was the fact that he didn't know who either truly was that bothered him. The fact that his former wife could be either of them left him with a sinking feeling. "We'd better check on the kids," he said. Several minutes later, the entire family had gathered together in the living room. Delilah smiled in amusement as she leaned back on the couch and watched her little brother, amazed that he was also her former mother. "It seemed so funny. I am not a little boy," Brandon said, trying to sound mature but failing with his little boy's voice. Even he wasn't completely confident of his claim since he was getting bored of talking and wanted to go draw pictures with his crayons. "Well, you look like one to me," Delilah sneered, earning her a glare. Jerry sighed. "Enough of that, you two." He looked at Brandon and said, "I'm sorry this isn't what we expected, but there is nothing that we can do about it now. So you're just gonna make more stupid inventions." She got the word out, feeling a little bitter but at the same time very intimidated by her daddy. "Enough of that," Veronica snapped. She glared at Brandon, knowing that he used to be her mother, but that hardly seemed to matter. All she really saw when she looked at him was her son. The same little boy that she remembered giving birth to and raising. She certainly wasn't going to take that kind of talk from her son. Brandon cringed under the eyes of his mommy. He told himself that it was really his daughter, but he certainly didn't feel like a mommy anymore. In fact, when he looked at her he saw his mommy. She didn't look anything like what little Melissa had, making it very difficult for him to keep thinking of her as such. Pouting, Brandon sat back, knowing that they were right. They were who they were, not who they used to be. When she looked at all of them, she saw Brandon's family. His mommy, daddy and big sister, not Jean's family. He could barely even think of them as Jean's family as it was and knew that it wouldn't be long at all before he wouldn't at all. Sure, he'd remember them, but that would be all. Delilah looked down at her breasts and smiled, absently thinking that she couldn't wait to show her figure off at school. She giggled to herself, knowing that she might remember having done so nearly every day, but that didn't mean she couldn't take advantage of her new identity and do it again. It certainly might not be the life AJ would have chose, but she more than liked it. Smiling, Veronica put her hand on her husband's and looked at her children. It almost seemed unbelievable that she had also been a little girl such a short time ago, but that didn't really matter anymore. All that mattered now was that she was Veronica, a wife and mother, and that she had to do her best at both. Jerry smiled at his children and Veronica. She was so hot that he nearly blushed to remember their honeymoon. Then, shaking his head clear, he suggested, "Why don't we take a little family vacation to Hawaii for a week?" They all brightened at that, even Brandon, whose childish side loved the idea. Then Jerry smiled to himself, hardly able to believe just how much things had been changed, just because of a stupid invention, which he never planned to attempt again. Just because they'd all walked through the gate.